In the early hours of May 12, 1945, beneath a sky heavy with tropical moisture and the slow drift of monsoon clouds, a shallow trench carved into the Burmese earth became the fulcrum upon which lives, loyalties, and empires quietly balanced. The jungle pressed in on every side, dense and indifferent, its undergrowth alive with insects and the distant tremor of movement. In that suffocating darkness, 3 Gurkha riflemen crouched low in mud that clung to their uniforms and rifles alike, listening as nearly 200 Japanese soldiers advanced through the undergrowth toward their isolated position. At the forwardmost edge of the British defensive line, they were less a unit than a thin seam of resistance, a fragile human barrier separating 2 converging forces shaped by decades of imperial ambition and industrialized war. Among them was Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung, 27 years old, standing just 4 feet 11 inches tall, his flight frame dwarfed by the Lee-Enfield rifle resting in his hands. The weapon itself was a product of a global industrial system that spanned continents, its steel forged, machined, and assembled through networks of extraction and manufacture, linking British factories to colonial battlefields. In his grip, that rifle was not merely an instrument of personal defense, but a node in a vast structure of modern warfare, an empire's reach made tangible in walnut and metal. Gurung's trench was the most forward post in the entire defensive perimeter. If it collapsed, the Japanese assault would spill through the gap, sweep along the flank, and envelop 2 companies of Gurkhas positioned behind him. What stood before the attackers was not simply 3 men in mud. It was the hinge of a defensive system painstakingly arranged by officers studying maps, supply lines, and terrain, all of it dependent on the endurance of those at the very edge. By 1945, the Burma campaign had become a grinding contest fought as much against geography and logistics as against opposing armies. Roads dissolved into rivers of mud, aircraft carried supplies where trucks could not, and men endured disease, hunger, and exhaustion as constant companions. The Japanese Imperial Army, driven by its own strategic calculations and imperial doctrine, had pushed deep into Southeast Asia earlier in the war, threatening British India and destabilizing colonial hierarchies that had seemed permanent only years before. Now, as the conflict turned against Japan, scattered engagements like this one determined whether advances would hold or falter. In such places, global power was distilled into the immediate calculus of survival. Who would hold the line long enough for dawn, for reinforcements, for history to tilt 1 degree further in a direction no single soldier could fully comprehend? If you're enjoying this story so far, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow and keeps stories like this alive. All right, let's get back to it. At 1:20 in the morning, the waiting ended. The first grenade arced through the darkness, its silhouette briefly visible against the dim canopy before landing just outside the trench. Gurung reacted with reflex born of training and instinct. He lunged forward, scooped the explosive device from the mud, and hurled it back into the jumble from which it had come. The detonation split the night in a flash of white heat, illuminating the tangle of vegetation, and for a heartbeat, revealing the forms of Japanese soldiers rushing forward. In that strobe of light, modern war's contradictions were laid bare. Men propelled by industrially produced munitions and imperial orders, reduced to fleeting shapes in the glare of a single explosion. Another grenade landed inside the trench itself. There was no time for deliberation, no space for abstraction. He seized it and threw it toward the attackers. It detonated in mid-air, scattering fragments into the darkness. The jungle swallowed the sound, but the assault did not slow. The grenades were not isolated acts. They were the opening strokes of a coordinated attempt to overwhelm a critical position through shock and volume, leveraging numbers against isolation. In that narrow trench, the logic of industrial warfare, Mass, momentum, saturation, pressed against the fragile limits of human endurance. A third grenade landed at Gurung's feet. The timing was merciless, the space unforgiving. He bent to retrieve it as he had the others. This time there was no chance to throw. The explosion tore through the trench in a concussive blast that collapsed sound into a single, overwhelming roar. The fingers of his right hand were blown away in an instant. Shrapnel tore into his face, destroying his right eye. Burns seared his arm, chest, and legs. The same blast wounded the two other Gurkhas beside him, leaving them incapacitated amid the smoke and debris. In seconds, the trench transformed from a defensive outpost into a crucible of pain and chaos. In the larger calculus of war, such injuries often signaled the end of a soldier's role in a fight. Medical evacuation, if possible, would follow; if not, surrender or death. Industrialized armies trained their men in discipline and obedience, but they also relied on predictable thresholds of human capacity. A soldier missing fingers, half-blind, burned, and bleeding was statistically unlikely to continue effective resistance. Yet statistics dissolve in the immediacy of survival. As Japanese soldiers charged toward the trench, screaming, firing, throwing more grenades, Gurung found himself at the intersection of physical devastation and absolute necessity. Behind him lay two companies of Gurkhas vulnerable if the line broke. Before him advanced an enemy force intent on breaching the perimeter. Bleeding heavily, vision reduced to a single eye, his dominant hand mutilated, Gurung did not withdraw. He shifted his Lee-Enfield rifle into his left hand and began firing. The rifle's bolt, designed for speed and reliability, demanded practiced coordination. Reloading required dexterity, strength, and rhythm, qualities now compromised by injury. Yet the mechanics of the weapon, standardized and familiar, provided a structure within which even a wounded man could operate. He fired, worked the bolt with his remaining hand, adjusted his aim, and fired again. Each shot represented not only an act of defiance, but the continuation of a defensive system that depended entirely on his persistence. For the next 4 hours, the trench became a singular point of resistance. Japanese soldiers surged forward in repeated attempts to overrun the position, leveraging their numerical superiority in the belief that sustained pressure would eventually break whatever remained inside. Gurung answered with disciplined fire, each round carefully directed into the darkness from which the attackers emerged. He shouted challenges into the night, invoking the identity of the Gurkhas, an identity forged through.
The British Empire had long cultivated the image of the Gurkha as a warrior race, a narrative that both constrained and empowered those who lived within it. In that trench, the mythology was stripped of abstraction, decades of recruitment into the British Indian Army, shaped by colonial policy and mutual reliance, and tested against reality. The hours stretched with brutal slowness. The jungle, indifferent to ideology, absorbed the sounds of combat, the crack of rifle shots, the dull thud of grenades, the cries of the wounded. Mud mixed with blood. Smoke drifted low across the trench. Gurung's injuries did not lessen. They compounded with fatigue and shock. Yet he continued to fire, to reload, to hold his position. His two wounded comrades could not effectively contribute to the defense. The trench that had begun the night as a shared responsibility became, in practice, a solitary stand. In industrial warfare, heroism is often obscured by scale. Battles are mapped in arrows and divisions. Victories are attributed to logistics, air superiority, production capacity. Yet those macro-level forces ultimately compress into moments like this, where the outcome hinges on whether a single individual continues to act. Gurung's stand did not occur in isolation from broader systems. It was made possible by them. His rifle, his training, the defensive layout, the very presence of British and Japanese forces in Burma, All were products of geopolitical rivalry and industrial mobilization. But within that vast architecture, the immediate determinant of survival was his refusal to yield. As the night wore on, the attackers faced a dilemma of their own. Repeated attempts to overwhelm the trench met with sustained resistance. Each advance incurred casualties. The element of surprise had evaporated in the glare of the first explosions. Momentum stalled against a defense that by all reasonable expectations should have collapsed minutes after the third grenade detonated. Instead, it persisted. The psychological impact of encountering continued accurate fire from a position believed to be neutralized compounded the physical losses. In the calculus of assault, doubt is corrosive. When dawn finally approached, a pale gray light began to seep through the canopy. The silhouettes of trees sharpened. The outlines of bodies emerged from shadow. The Japanese assault faltered and then receded, the attackers withdrawing from a position that had resisted beyond expectation. As the first full light of morning revealed the ground before the trench, 31 enemy soldiers lay dead in front of Gurung's position. 31 lives ended in the span of 4 hours by a man who, by every conventional measure of battlefield survivability, should not have remained capable of sustained combat. The trench, once a fragile seam in a defensive line, had held. The 2 companies behind it were not overrun. A tactical objective, maintaining the perimeter, was achieved not through reinforcement or strategic maneuver, but through the endurance of a single wounded rifleman. In the broader narrative of the Burma campaign, this engagement would occupy only a small space, a footnote in operational reports and regimental histories. Yet within that small space lay a concentration of the forces that defined the modern world: empire and resistance, industrial production and human limitation, ideology and survival. Gurung's stand did not alter the grand trajectory of the war on its own. By May 1945, Japan's strategic position was collapsing under the weight of Allied advances, blockades, and the overwhelming productive capacity of industrial economies. But at the level of lived experience, the preservation of that trench mattered profoundly. It preserved lives in the immediate sense and sustained the cohesion of a unit shaped by shared identity and discipline. It demonstrated that even in an era dominated by machines, artillery barrages, and aerial bombardment, the outcome of conflict could still hinge on the will of an individual confronted with annihilation. In the quiet after the assault, as medics tended to the wounded and reports were compiled, the enormity of what had occurred settled slowly. A man missing most of his right hand, blind in one eye, burned and bleeding, had held a position against overwhelming odds for 4 relentless hours. His survival contradicted the assumptions embedded in military planning and human physiology alike. Yet it also affirmed a truth that industrial modernity could not erase, that within vast systems of production and destruction, agency remains localized, fragile, and decisive. The muddy trench in the Burmese jungle was not a grand battlefield marked by monuments or sweeping maneuvers. It was a narrow cut in the earth, hastily fortified, easily overlooked on a map. But on that night, it became a microcosm of 20th century warfare, where global ambitions converged in intimate violence, and where the survival of many depended on the resolve of one. As daylight strengthened and the jungle resumed its restless hum, the line remained intact, the perimeter held. And in that fragile continuity lay the difference between collapse and endurance, between encirclement and survival, between anonymity and a story that would endure long after the mud had dried. In the aftermath of the assault, the physical reality of what had occurred stood in stark contrast to the abstractions that typically define war.
Reports would later reduce the event to numbers, enemy casualties, defensive success, injuries sustained, but numbers cannot fully capture the layered significance of that night. The British Indian Army, like the empire it served, depended on hierarchies of command and carefully managed flows of information. Yet at its foundation were men recruited from distant villages, drawn into global conflict by economic necessity, martial tradition, and the promises, sometimes fulfilled, often deferred, of imperial service. Gurung's presence in that trench was not accidental. It was the result of decades of British policy that identified certain Himalayan communities as reliable sources of disciplined soldiers, embedding them within imperial structures that stretched from London to the jungles of Southeast Asia.
For many young men from rural Nepal, enlistment offered wages unimaginable in subsistence agriculture, access to food security, and the possibility of remittances sent home to families living on the margins of survival. The British military machine, sustained by industrial wealth and colonial extraction, converted that economic disparity into manpower. In return, it cultivated fierce regimental identities, binding soldiers to one another through shared hardship and honor. By 1945, Gurkha regiments had earned reputations for resilience and ferocity in multiple theaters of war. That reputation was both a source of pride and a burden, reinforcing expectations that they would hold when others might falter. In the Burmese jungle, those expectations were stripped of ceremony and tested against exhaustion, disease, and relentless combat. The campaign itself had exposed the vulnerabilities of imperial power. Early Japanese advances shattered the illusion of European invincibility in Asia, demonstrating that industrial might did not guarantee dominance in unfamiliar terrain. The British response required immense logistical innovation, the expansion of air supply networks, the construction of precarious roads through mountainous wilderness, and the coordination of multinational forces across treacherous geography. By the time of the engagement in May 1945, the tide had turned, but the cost of regaining ground had been staggering. Each defended trench, each repelled assault, formed part of a broader effort to reassert control over contested space. As Gurung was evacuated for medical treatment, the material consequences of his injuries became clear. The loss of fingers on his right hand was permanent, the destruction of his right eye irreparable. Burns and shrapnel wounds would leave scars that outlasted the war itself. Industrial warfare did not merely kill, it maimed with efficiency, producing veterans whose bodies bore visible testimony to the scale of modern violence. For empires accustomed to projecting power abroad, the return of wounded soldiers posed complex questions about obligation and recognition. Decorations and commendations could honor sacrifice, but they could not restore lost limbs or erased vision. Yet recognition mattered. Within military culture, acts of extraordinary resistance served as moral anchors, reinforcing cohesion and purpose. Gurung's stand was eventually acknowledged at the highest levels, his actions deemed worthy of the most prestigious honors available within the British system. Such recognition functioned not only as personal validation, but as reinforcement of the regimental identity that had shaped his decision to continue fighting. In an army composed of diverse ethnicities, languages, and backgrounds, shared narratives of courage were essential to maintaining unity under strain. The Japanese soldiers who advanced that night were themselves products of a powerful industrial and ideological apparatus. Imperial Japan had mobilized its population through a fusion of nationalism, emperor-centered loyalty, and a doctrine that valorized sacrifice. Its expansion across East and Southeast Asia was driven by a desire for resources, strategic depth, and autonomy from Western-dominated economic systems.
In Burma, Japanese forces sought to disrupt Allied supply lines to China and weaken British influence in India. Their soldiers endured privation and fought with determination shaped by a belief in the necessity of their mission. The confrontation in that trench thus represented more than a clash of individuals. It was a collision between rival visions of regional order, each sustained by industrial capacity and ideological conviction. But on the ground, ideology narrowed to survival. As dawn revealed the bodies before the trench, the human cost of strategic ambition lay unambiguously displayed. 31 soldiers dead in the space of a few dozen yards. Behind each uniform had been a life shaped by family, culture, and expectation. Industrialized war amplifies death through scale, yet it also compresses it into intimate proximities. Gurung, firing from his trench, did not confront faceless abstractions. He confronted advancing men whose intentions were immediate and lethal. In that sense, the modern battlefield retains an ancient quality, even as it is supplied and contextualized by global systems. The endurance required to hold that trench for 4 hours cannot be separated from training, discipline, and identity. Military preparation seeks to override instinctive impulses towards self-preservation in moments of extreme danger. Drills repeated in training grounds far from Burma were designed to become reflexes under fire. The act of picking up and throwing back grenades, of operating a bolt-action rifle under stress, of maintaining position despite injury, these were behaviors cultivated through repetition and reinforced by collective expectation. Gurung's continuation after catastrophic injury speaks not only to personal resolve, but to the depth at which such conditioning can shape response. Yet, training alone cannot account for the decision to remain when withdrawal might have seemed rational. The forward trench was tactically critical. If it fell, the Japanese would have gained access to the flank, potentially unraveling the entire defensive arrangement. Gurung understood this in practical terms. Even if he could not see the broader map, he knew the men behind him depended on that position holding. Responsibility in such moments becomes intensely localized. The abstract language of empire dissolves, replaced by the concrete knowledge that comrades' lives hinge on one's own actions. In the final months of the Second World War, attention in Europe focused on the collapse of Nazi Germany, while in the Pacific, anticipation of Japan's defeat intensified. Yet for those still fighting in Burma, the war was not an abstraction nearing conclusion. It was a daily contest marked by ambushes, assaults, and attrition. The global timeline of impending victory offered little comfort in the immediacy of night combat. Gurung's stand occurred against a backdrop of shifting geopolitical currents, but within the trench, only the present mattered, the next grenade, the next silhouette emerging from shadow. As the jungle absorbed the echoes of gunfire and the day warmed the mud underfoot, the trench resumed its function as part of a defensive network. Repairs would be made, positions reinforced, ammunition replenished. The system moved forward, incorporating the night's events into its ongoing operation. In this way, modern militaries metabolize individual acts into institutional memory.
Reports were written, citations drafted, lessons extracted. But the lived experience of those hours, of pain endured, of fear confronted, of relentless firing through darkness, remains irreducibly personal. For Gurung, survival marked the beginning of a different struggle. The physical limitations imposed by his injuries would shape the remainder of his life. Reintegration into civilian existence after severe wounding is rarely straightforward. Veterans carry not only scars, but the memory of moments that defy ordinary comprehension. In societies marked by economic hardship, the challenge of adapting to permanent disability can be compounded by limited access to resources. The British Empire's relationship with its colonial soldiers did not always extend seamlessly into peacetime support.
Recognition in the form of medals could coexist with bureaucratic indifference in matters of pensions and long-term care. Still, the image of a wounded rifleman holding a trench against overwhelming odds resonated far beyond the immediate battlefield. It entered regimental lore, military history, and the broader narrative of a war defined by both mechanized devastation and individual acts of endurance. In the grand sweep of industrial conflict, where factories, shipyards, and laboratories often appear as the primary engines of victory, such stories remind us that the final execution of strategy occurs at human scale. Machines extend reach and multiply force, but they do not eliminate the necessity of choice under fire. The muddy trench in Burma was a small fragment of a vast war, yet it illuminates the layered realities of 20th century conflict. Empires mobilized resources extracted from colonies. Factories transformed raw materials into weapons. Transport networks carried men across oceans. But when those men reached the front lines, the outcome of specific engagements could hinge on the capacity of one wounded soldier to continue acting beyond reasonable expectation. Gurung's stand exemplifies that paradox. It was made possible by global systems, yet it transcended them through personal resolve. As the war in Southeast Asia moved toward its conclusion, the strategic map shifted steadily in favor of the Allies. Japanese positions contracted, supply lines frayed. The immense industrial output of the United States and the British Commonwealth exerted pressure that no isolated act of battlefield bravery could counterbalance. And yet, without countless local resistances, without trenches that held and units that refused to break, the broader momentum might have faltered. History often privileges sweeping narratives of production statistics and diplomatic conferences, but those narratives are sustained by moments like the one that unfolded in darkness on May 12, 1945. In that narrow strip of mud carved into the Burmese jungle, the abstractions of industrialized empire and ideological war condensed into the choices of a single man. Bleeding, half-blind, and grievously wounded, he refused surrender. Through 4 relentless hours, he transformed a position expected to fall into a barrier that endured. When dawn revealed the cost, it also affirmed a truth that persists across eras. That even within the most mechanized and systematized forms of conflict, the human capacity for endurance can alter the immediate course of events. And in that alteration, measured not in grand strategy, but in lives preserved, lies the enduring significance of a trench that did not yield. By the time the sun fully rose over the Burmese jungle, the trench was quiet, the assault broken, the line intact. The war would continue for months, shaped by fleets, factories, and decisions made in distant capitals. But nothing that followed could erase what had happened in that strip of mud. A global conflict driven by industry and empire had narrowed to one wounded rifleman refusing to let go of his post. In the end, the trench held not because of numbers or machines, but because a single man chose again and again to stand his ground.
If this story meant something to you, hit like. It really helps. And tell me in the comments, do you think courage like this still exists today? Subscribe if you want more real stories that remind us what people are truly capable of. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.